Woohoo! Oh, you just love to see it. Smash like if you love to see it. When you love to see censorship blow up in the face of Silicon Valley companies, especially one as censorious as Patreon. Now, this is breaking news via Mike Cernovich, who has been following a case with Patreon for weeks now. And to give you just a little bit of the background, essentially, somebody was banned. Here, I'll actually go to the Daily Dot article of it. Is obviously not, I don't know what Owen Benjamin's political affiliations are. I just know that anytime a website like the alt-right or the Daily Dot says something like this, it's probably a lie. I don't know, though. I don't know Owen Benjamin. I don't care. All I care about is censorious big tech getting hosed. So all these people wrote articles about how he didn't have a chance, and life was gonna catch up with him, and get wrecked. Well, last October, Patreon banned Owen Benjamin, a commentator and self-styled comedian, for violating its policies against words they don't like. Now, Patreon's ban. I'm gonna try to cut out the this kind of crap, which is clearly an opinion. Again, I don't know. Maybe this dude actually claims that he is that. I don't know. Patreon's ban came amidst a flurry of other platforms kicking him off as well. Benjamin is banned by YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for other words they didn't like. Earlier this year, the Daily Dot reported that he had tried to sneak back onto YouTube and Twitter and got caught and summarily booted again. According to court documents, Benjamin subsequently filed a $2.2 million claim against Patreon for banning him. He later upped that demand to $3.5 million. He also got 100 of his fans, also known as bears, to file separate identical claims against Patreon for kicking him off the platform. Court records state that Benjamin used a multitude of individual claims, all of which were filed by his lawyers as leverage to an attempt to convince Patreon to settle. It refused. Now Patreon is suing 72 of his fans. Get wrecked, right? Quote, the lawsuit is about keeping words we don't like off Patreon. The company told Daily Dot via email, we won't allow former users to extort Patreon, and are moving those frivolous claims to court where they belong. Unlike the prior claims, the suit against Benjamin's fans is filed in California state. Patreon's previous terms of service required claims to be submitted to arbitration, like Benjamin's $3.5 million cause of action. An update to its terms of service that went into effect on January 1st both prohibits users from filing claims based on the platform kicking someone off and requires anyone else to do so to pay the company's attorney fees and costs. What they tried to do was put this in because they knew the suit was coming, right? They tried to slide in the terms of service update, and the judge wasn't having it. Benjamin's fans claims against Patreon were filed on January 6th, according to the documents. Thus, if Patreon wins the suit, Benjamin's fans could be on the hook for a significant sum, which may negatively impact their ability to chip into the $1.5 million ranch in northern Idaho that he's lately been begging for the cash to buy himself. All right, so obviously this article is fairly biased, but then you saw this article. Owen Benjamin and his personal army collided with reality. Free speech. So all these sites were basically mocking him, right? Well, update, Patreon lost. Now, there's more to this, okay? But this is huge. Huge, huge, huge. So I want to go back to July 13th when everything started, okay, to give you an update here. This is Cernovich reporting live from major legal action. Several former patrons of Benjamin filed arbitration actions against Patreon after Benjamin was banned. Patreon then sued those former backers in California state. Under California law, Patreon is obligated to pay in advance all arbitration fees in the case involving Owen Benjamin's former backers. Millions of dollars. Seeking to avoid these fees, Patreon moved for an injunction to shut down arbitration. Several people who are, quote, not lawyers claim that Patreon will prevail in its motion against Benjamin's backers. In fact, the law is pretty clear. Patreon should lose its lawsuit and be sent back into arbitration. I'll report live once court issues its ruling. After Patreon sued Owen Benjamin's former backers, the so-called Bears retained a prominent lawyer to represent themselves against Patreon. I'm here live reporting. More details to come. Court. The tentative ruling is to deny the motion for injunctive relief. Patreon has presumably lost unless they are able to persuade the judge at this hearing to reverse himself. Essentially, Patreon's going to have to pony up for hundreds of lawsuits to enter arbitration up front. This is a massive sum of cash. Unless the judge in Patreon reverses himself, then Patreon's loss in court today will be devastating. They will be on the hook for hundreds of arbitration fees. But anything can happen at any given moment. Will the judge overrule himself? We'll soon find out. Under the court's preliminary ruling, any large creator banned by Patreon can have his or her backers move for arbitration. Patreon will have to pay millions of dollars in legal fees up front. This is a huge workaround for big tech censorship. And you start to wonder about other people who have been banned by Patreon. Myself, Sargon of Akkad, any of these people who are active, who are banned off Patreon. Maybe it's time to bury them in legal fees. The logic being applied in the Patreon can be used against PayPal when PayPal bans accounts. The Patreon lawsuit outcome has a major implication. A new legal front just opened up. Patreon's lawyers is citing cases that he didn't disclose to opposing counsel, which is not standard practice. Judge seems like he may in fact seek further briefing on procedural issue. Patreon bans Owen Benjamin. 72 of Benjamin's backers tell Patreon they will move for arbitration. Patreon amended its terms of service to try and bar those claims. Backers move for arbitration. Patreon loses procedural rules in arbitration. Lawsuit against those backers are filed. That's basically what happened. Now, the judge in the Patreon case is a very straight-laced guy. He understands the law. He's wondering why so many people are watching the hearing. Culture clash for sure. Quote, the arbitration claims will be substantial, Patreon's lawyer says, in claiming that Patreon will suffer irreparable harm. The judge cites, quote, gig economy lawsuit DoorDash lost in response to Patreon's lawyer's argument. He goes on to say, we understand the old argument for gamesmanship. The old argument allowed for gamesmanship, Patreon lawyers add, which is why Patreon changed the terms of service. Judge is pushing back, reply, how Patreon unilaterally changed the terms of service. Now the lawyer is up, and Patreon versus Owen Benjamin backers lawsuit. The court's tentative ruling went against Patreon, but oral argument may have persuaded the judge to modify his order. His legal drama happening in San Francisco Superior Court. The judge in Patreon case is fantastic. He's well prepared. He really did his homework. Impressed with him for sure. Mark Randazza argues Patreon set up terms of service to mandate arbitration. Patreon lost rules in arbitration. Now Patreon wants the court order to stop the arbitrations. The judge is seeking further briefing on procedural issue and will take the matter into submission. The tentative ruling went against Patreon, but the court is going to ask for further briefing. We will now have to wait a couple of weeks for formal judgment, which we just had. Update, Patreon lost. Massive! The judge applied well-established law and denied Patreon's motion cited against them in their lawsuit against Owen Benjamin's fans. Patreon will now be forced to arbitrate 100+ claims and pay upfront for the fees for up to $10,000 per arbitration. Now you can read the court, you can read the denial right here. Filed. Order denying preliminary injunction. Patreon is seeking injunction to enjoin defendants from continuing to pursue improper claims against Patreon in JM's arbitration, pending this court's consideration and final adjudication of Patreon's complaint for declaratory judgment. Defendants are individual claimants in 72 pending JM's arbitration proceedings against Patreon. Patreon claims that those are barred by its terms of use because they involve non-arbitrable claims. Patreon's request for a preliminary injunction is denied for several reasons. Oh, it just feels so good. Ooh. Oh my God. I wonder if This will open them if other people now who are banned can actually sue, or if it's only these people. I should ask Mike, but I don't have Twitter anymore. First, Patreon fails to show that it will suffer irreparable injury or interim harm if an injunction does not issue. JAMS has agreed to determine the threshold of jurisdictional issues Patreon raises and will afford Patreon an opportunity to object to its jurisdiction in the course of arbitration proceedings. Second, Patreon fails to show a reasonable likelihood of prevailing on its claims, meaning they're not, the court isn't convinced that Patreon will win. Even if Patreon were correct that defendants' claims are not arbitrable, those issues are for the arbiter, not the court, to decide. Third, California courts rarely grant extraordinary relief. Patreon seeks here an injunction interfering with the ongoing contractual arbitration proceeding. Once a dispute is submitted to arbitration, the California Arbitration Act contemplates limited, if any, judicial involvement. To be sure that Patreon is correct in this principle and not an inflexible one, however, the cases that Patreon cited for the first time at the hearing do not support its position. Woo-hoo-hoo! Get 'em, boys! Look, I love it. I love it. I hope other people who are banned from Patreon consider exploring this and to bury them for censoring users and irreparably damaging them. Well, I wonder if this would extend to PayPal or, for example, Squarespace. We just saw Squarespace shut down. It's not the first time, but Squarespace has several times, in several occasions, shut down various websites because, you know, they just don't like who runs them or they don't like what they're selling. Web hosting platform Squarespace has shut down the website of America's Frontline Doctors. You saw this. These are the people that did the conference that the world didn't like. Say, wow, our website host Squarespace has just completely and arbitrarily shut down our website, claiming it's a violation of their terms of service. We are a group of physicians advocating for a better understanding of everything going on right now, and that's available at treatment options. This is outrageous. It is. Is Squarespace a doctor? We have to start fighting back against these things, and whatever your opinion is about Owen Benjamin, I wish him all the best in taking it to Patreon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Smash like. If you haven't subscribed, please make today the day you hit that subscribe button right down below the video. It makes finding my videos much easier, and I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this video. We'll talk to you again real soon.